Good morning, everyone. Not so long ago in Emmanuel, we were thinking a lot about Christ's resurrection, and some of us made some comments about how often we think and talk about Christ's suffering and death far more than his victorious resurrection. And I just wanted to remind us not to make that mistake, as Peter does in this chapter, Mark 8. If you haven't already, I'd recommend that you pause the video and read Mark 8 from verse 27 down to the end. This is where Jesus is telling his disciples what's going to happen to him, and Peter rebukes him. Jesus says, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again." And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Now, several things are going on here. Peter's setting his mind on the things of man and not of God. He's thinking about what he thinks Jesus has come to do and not on God's salvation plan. He also loves Christ and doesn't want him to suffer and die. But it strikes me that Peter doesn't really seem to react to the fact that Jesus has just announced his greatest miracle. That Jesus has just announced that after 3 days he's going to rise again from death. And Jesus said this plainly. The disciples had just followed Jesus and watched him gather a huge following and demonstrate his power through these amazing miracles, and things seem to be going quite well at the moment. And Peter's looking at his life, looking at the way he sees the world, and he's acting on that. He's living based on the way he sees the world, and he's ignoring the truth that Christ has just told him. We need to take care not to make that same mistake. At the moment, life is strange and difficult. People's jobs have changed. We can't see our friends and family and loved ones in the same way. We have to meet at 2-meter distances and sometimes wear masks. It's so unnatural, and it's tempting to look at the world and maybe despair, or live in such a way that is based on how we feel and how we see the world and what's going on around us, instead of basing our lives on the truths of the gospel, instead of basing our lives on the fact that Christ is risen. We have a risen Saviour, a Saviour who's risen from death to conquer death, to be our mediator, and to sit on his throne and reign forever. We need to remember that. We need to use that as fuel to do what Christ has commanded us to do. And just a few verses later, Jesus says, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." Where does Jesus want us to follow him to? Now, we ought to be ready to risk our lives for Christ's sake and the gospel's sake. But do we follow Jesus only to the grave? Is that it? No, we have a risen Saviour. We follow Jesus, we take up our crosses and suffer and follow him to new life without sin, a new life where we can know God because of Christ, because of our living Saviour. Now, taking up our crosses and following Jesus isn't easy. Many of you might be ridiculed for when you tell people what you're using Zoom for on the weekends or on Wednesday evenings. You might live with family members or be separated from family members who don't know Christ, and you suffer with that every day. Some of you may have suffered persecution far greater than what most of us can imagine here in the UK. No matter how you see the world, don't ignore the fact that Christ is risen. Peter, a few years later, in 1 Peter 4, writes, "But rejoice in so far as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed." Jesus is coming back because we have a risen Saviour. No matter how you see the world, remind yourself that Christ is risen. Meditate on that. Don't ignore it, so that we can deny ourselves, take up our crosses, and worship the risen Saviour and rejoice.